Good morning, everyone. My name is Henry Rain, and I'm at the New York Historical Society in New York City. I'm here to introduce our next speaker. Tom Horrocks, my friend and colleague, has had a distinguished career in library administration, including positions as director of the Center for the History of Medicine at the Countway Library at Harvard Medical School, as associate librarian for collections at the Houghton Library, Harvard, and as director of the John Hay Library at Brown University.
So I'm just going to explain a little bit about the relationship between print and politics in 19th century America. Then we'll get into some images, which I hope that you will find interesting. It was during the 1830s and 1840s that both Democrats and Whigs developed party structures that 21st century politicians would recognize. The Republican Party would do the same in the mid-1850s. County, district, state, and national committees managed party operations by identifying potential candidates, articulating campaign themes, drafting programs, holding meetings and conventions, and assembling lists of voters, identifying and providing speakers, raising funds and mobilizing voters by organizing barbecues, parades, and rallies. Turning out voters and electing candidates required an effective communications network. Thus, Democrats, Whigs, Republicans, and other parties established newspapers, cultivated editors, enlisted journalists, and published and distributed pamphlets, tracts, and other forms of printed material. None of this would have been possible, however, without the transformative advances in the realm of communications. An effective communications operation was essential to the success of political parties in 19th century America, when the worlds of politics and print were intertwined, each sphere shaping the other. Print's integral role in American political affairs dated back to the Revolutionary War, when almanacs, broadsides, newspapers, and pamphlets were used to promote the American cause. An American publishing industry emerged during the decades following the American Revolution, and several factors contributed to this emergence. One was an expanding mass education, which resulted in increased literacy, producing a literate consumer base, 90% of white men and women by 1850, technological innovations in the printing trade, such as stereotyping, steam-powered printing presses, and paper-making machines. Advances in transportation also helped, such as turnpikes, canal, steamboats, and of course, the railroad. And then there were advances in communications such as the telegraph. So starting in the 1820s, newspapers became the favorite print medium for political news. Many publishers found politics to be profitable on many levels in the decades prior to the Civil War. Aligning one's newspaper with a political party and producing pamphlets and other genres of print on the party's behalf provided not only financial backing and remuneration for a publisher and editor, but it could also, and often did, lead to a lucrative patronage appointment or even to a political career. As the American political system became less deferential to elites and voting requirements were relaxed to broaden the franchise, at least for white men, politicians and parties moved away from the traditional practice of securing favor with other politicians in power and turned to direct appeals to the public through speeches, parades, conventions, and communication through print, especially newspapers. As newspapers became essential to the communications network of political parties, their editors, no matter how humble their origins or defective their education, assumed political influence and power never imagined by their 18th century counterparts. Editors of national party organs and other partisan papers became party insiders and leaders, roles they maintained throughout the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and for the decades following the Civil War. Over the course of the 19th century, voter participation increased significantly, averaging 78% in presidential elections, reflecting the growing interest in politics among Americans during this period. And as more Americans became engaged in the political process, they demanded more political information. And party operatives, acutely aware of the link between effective communication and voter mobilization, were eager to meet this demand. The famous 1840 log cabin campaign, presidential campaign, is a prime example of a political party, in this case the Whigs, using print in innovative and incredibly effective ways in devising and communicating a message, and just as important, an image to energize voters. Linked to a popular slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, they promoted its candidate, General William Henry Harrison, a man born into a wealthy Virginia family, as a rustic, hard cider drinking man of the people who wore a coonskin hat and lived in a simple log cabin. His opponent, President Martin Van Buren, whose origins were more humble than those of Harrison, was portrayed by the Whigs as an elite fop who spent lavishly on fine china for the executive mansion, a president out of touch with the average American. In the 1840s, the Whigs used every genre of print available to mobilize voters, including almanacs, pamphlets, campaign biographies, and special campaign newspapers, all ephemeral in nature. While the newspaper was essential to the mass communication network of political parties, it was not the only genre of print available to and used by party organizations. And as you will see in a moment, there were a variety of forms of ephemera which I will be showing. And I'm going to be concentrating today on paper only, though there were tons of material, three-dimensional material, that was also created during these elections. It is important to note, however, that political parties and partisans did not monopolize the production of these various forms of printed material. Taking advantage of advances in printing technology and transportation, as well as the rise of an urban middle-class consumer, commercial firms and entrepreneurs were, by the 1840s, active in producing printed material of a political nature. Not so much competing against political organizations as aiding and abetting them. Commercial publishing houses and printing firms pursued an agenda that was driven by profit rather than politics, whereas political organizations produced material in order to persuade and mobilize voters to cast ballots for a particular candidate or party. Commercial firms tended to be nonpartisan, publishing books, engravings, or sheet music that promoted the fortunes of every candidate in the race. After all, it made good business sense to meet the needs of potential clients regardless of their political persuasion. So now I want to get to the good stuff and just show you a selection of the various forms of ephemera that were produced during 19th century presidential elections. And I'm not going to cover everything. There's going to be some formats that I'm going to leave out because it could take me all day to I could give a paper just on one particular form type of ephemera. So I just wanted, this would be basically a tip of the iceberg. So let's start with pamphlets. And I'm just going to show one example of a pamphlet that was produced for the 1864 campaign. And this was an anti-Lincoln. Lincoln now is running for re-election. And this was an anti-Lincoln pamphlet called the Lincoln Catechism. And as you can see that it was published by J.F. Feeks, a publisher in New York, who produced several anti-Lincoln pamphlets, not quite sure what the political persuasion of Feeks was, and actually who paid for this. Was this paid for by the Democratic Party, or actually was Feeks just a Democrat partisan who wanted to produce this on his own? The two big issues in the 1864 election were obviously the Civil War. The Democratic Party ran on a platform against the war, calling for negotiations to end the war. Unfortunately, bad timing for the Democrats. Within a week of their convention and their nomination of their presidential candidate, who was General George McClellan, who had been fired by Lincoln as a Union general back in 1862, within a week, Sherman took Atlanta. And the fortunes of the war turned dramatically in favor of the Union cause. Up to that point, Lincoln wasn't even sure he was going to be reelected because the country was, quite frankly, sick of war. But with the Atlanta campaign and then the Mobile Bay for the Union Navy victory, that changed it dramatically. However, there was another issue that, depending on how the war went, it was still a major issue for some in the Democratic Party, and that was that Lincoln had abused the powers of the office, that by suspending habeas corpus during wartime was unconstitutional. The Emancipation Proclamation, we all think about that as one of the great achievements of Lincoln, but during the time, it was very controversial in the North. And so Lincoln was looked upon as a tyrant. And so the Lincoln Catechism, as you can see from the cover here, played on these racist fears and racist attitudes of many in the North against Lincoln's reelection. And the Catechism, those of you who were raised as Catholics on the Baltimore Catechism know if you look at a Baltimore Catechism, who is God, blah, 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 all those things. This was on the same end. Who is Lincoln? Well, Lincoln is a despot. What is Lincoln's main goal of his presidency? It is to promote the equal rights of black people, intermarriage of blacks, and so on and so forth. So this was a very racist pamphlet, but this gives you a sense. There were tons and tons, hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets produced during these various elections. Many of these pamphlets were speeches given by congressmen of one party or another, and that they were produced by the party organizations and were sent out to constituency free due to the franking privileges that various congressmen had. Then, of course, there were campaign newspapers. And I talked about the 1840 Log Cabin campaign. These were newspapers that were produced on a weekly or monthly basis between the time that the candidates were nominated and the election. And basically, these papers were filled with all kinds of news promoting a particular candidate and also news basically ripping apart the opposing candidate. And of course, this was the Log Cabin campaign. And I had mentioned that, that creating an image was very important for the Whig Party in 1840. And I wanted just to point this out. The log cabin was sort of a symbol that was used over and over and over again in the 1840 campaign on virtually every kind of print material and ephemera that was produced. You see this over and over again. In 1860, the Rail Splitter, this was a campaign newspaper in favor of Lincoln's election. There were actually two Rail Splitters. One was produced in Chicago and one was produced in Cincinnati. Here again, the many in the Republican Party in 1860 were Whigs in the 1840s and remembered the success of the log cabin campaign 20 years before, and they realized that it was successful then, and if we can come up with an image that will motivate voters, and it was Lincoln, the self-made man, the man of the prairie, the rail splitter. And so again, you see the rail splitter image used a lot in the 1860 election. Campaign biographies, and this is something that I collect. I just want to give you two examples here. Getting back to the log cabin campaign again of 1840, this is one of several campaign biographies of William Henry Harrison, candidate of the people for President of the United States. As I said, there were a lot of print produced during presidential elections. But what if you were sitting on the fence, you didn't really know a whole lot about Harrison or a whole lot about Martin Van Buren, his opponent in the election? Where did one turn to find out the biography, the story of these particular candidates? Well, there were numerous campaign biographies that were available. Some issued by the parties themselves, some issued by commercial firms who were taking advantage of the extreme interest that Americans had in the 19th century around presidential elections. Biographies such as this actually would have, in many cases, the image of the candidate on its cover. And in a biography such as this, since Harrison was basically being promoted as a military hero, there would be engravings inside this biography of various battles that Harrison was involved in. In 1860, Lincoln ran against three different candidates. This is Stephen A. Douglas, Senator of Illinois, who was one of two Democratic nominees, one representing the Northern Democrats, which was Douglas. Then there was also John Breckinridge, who was running for the Southern Democrats. I won't get into the whole story of why that occurred. But again, this is a typical campaign biography. Many of them were printed in paper wrappers. There were also, you could also buy them hardbound, but they would cost about $1, which was out of the range of many voters. Something like this, you can see a price was 25 cents, much more affordable for the average American voter. And many of these biographies also included excerpts of speeches that were given by the particular candidate over the span of their career. And the other thing that one must keep in mind, particularly for the earlier campaign biographies, in a time before photography, many voters had no idea what a particular candidate looked like. And the only way they could find that out was either an engraving that appeared on the cover of a campaign biography or on a piece of sheet music, et cetera, et cetera. Almanacs. Now, I know almanacs will be covered later, and so I just have one example here, but this, again, is relating to the 1840 campaign, the Hard Cider and Log Cabin Almanac. And again, making use of that image of the log cabin and the barrel of cider. How much cider Harrison actually drank, it was all exaggeration, of course, but it was a powerful symbol that was used in 1840. And Harrison won that election easily against Martin Van Buren. Broadsides. Again, here I'm going to show two examples from the 1840 campaign. Log cabin raising in Tompkins County. And this is in New York, obviously 1840. Again, using that theme of the log cabin. This was, a log cabin raising. This was a way of going out and showing your support for the Whig candidate for president. Again, another one. This is Harrison Informed from Alton, Illinois in 1840. And again, "To the Log Cabin Boys." And you can see this is an image of the candidate plowing the field next to his log cabin. I'm not even sure Harrison actually lived in a log cabin, but the fact is it stuck. People believed it. And over and over and over again, this was reinforced through various forms of ephemera that were produced during the 1840 campaign. Prints is another area. And, Currier and Ives, Kellogg, were two firms particularly noted for their color engravings and prints. And these were things that you could buy in Currier and Ives shops, or you could pick up at rallies. But this was for sort of, you could have these frames and you could have them hanging in your parlor to show your friends and your family, the candidate or the party you were supporting in would have been the 1864 election. This is Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. This was published in New York by Currier and Ives in 1864. Now, this was a racist, another racist thing against Lincoln. This is called the Miscegenation Ball, produced in New York by G.W. Bromley and Company in 1864. And this is what the Democrats were telling, if you reelect Lincoln, this is going to be the result. And if you notice here, there's the picture of a portrait of Lincoln. And then, of course, this is sort of supposed to be taking place in sort of a Republican campaign headquarters. And, of course, the message was very clear here, playing on the racist fears of many Americans, that this is what you were going to get if the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln were reelected. This is a later, getting back late into the century. This is a 1900 lithograph published in Milwaukee by W.J. Morgan and Company, Prosperity, William McKinley. William McKinley was running for re-election. He had been elected as a Republican in 1896. And he was running against William Jennings Bryan. He beat Bryan in 1896. Bryan ran again as a Democrat in 1900. But anyway, the message here was that, William McKinley and the Republican Party brought us prosperity. And this was the message by this gorgeous print from 1900. Posters. Here is something from the presidential campaign of 1864, New York, Lloyd and Company. This gives the candidates of the Democrat and the Republicans, and also their platform. And it gives brief biographies of previous presidents. This, again, was a large poster that would have been hung up on the sides on fences, on buildings, and again, it's just sort of getting the word out about the various candidates. Now, of course, this was something that was nonpartisan. This was presenting both parties on equal terms by Lloyd and Company. Here is a poster from the 1864 campaign promoting the Union nominations of Lincoln and Johnson. Actually, the Republican Party in 1864 changed its name temporarily to the Union Party. The message being, if you weren't for the Republican Party, you were for disunion. So, again, there you have it. This is sort of one of the holy grails of McKinley collectors, and even political collectors in general. Prosperity at Home, Prestige Abroad, published in Milwaukee by Northwestern Lithograph Company. Not quite sure whether this was for the 1896 election or the 1900 election, but this is one of the most sought-after color lithographic posters of the late 19th century. When I was collecting McKinley, this is one of the holy grails that I lusted after but could never afford, unfortunately. Something like this will go on the market today between $7,000 or $8,000. Little out of my collecting budget. But it's just a gorgeous poster. And of course, there you see the American flag. At home, prestige abroad. And you see in the background factories working at full capacity. You see commerce, the shipping, all brought about by President William McKinley. And the gold standard, that's right. As you notice, he is standing on a gold dollar. Bryan and the Democrats were running on a silver platform. I don't understand, I'm not going to get into all the details of trying to explain that, but the gold standard, of course, is what McKinley and the Republicans were promoting, and of course, he is on a gold dollar there. Another McKinley poster, this is the issue, 1900, Liberty, Justice, Humanity. William McKinley, the advance agent of prosperity. This was published in Cleveland, Ohio by the W.J. Morgan Company in 1896. This was a huge poster. It was about 5 foot high in height. It was made up of something like 10 different panels. This would have been something that would have been hung across a street for a parade or something of that sort. It would have been in pieces, paper, and then attached to probably a canvas background or mount. But a huge poster, gorgeous poster, and I've actually never seen a real one of these. If anyone has, more power to you. William Jennings Bryan in 1900, as in 1896, ran against McKinley on the Democratic Party. This was a poster promoting his candidacy. The issue, 1900, Liberty, Justice, Humanity. William Jennings Bryan, Columbus, Ohio, Neville Williams and Company in 1900. This was a lithograph by Strobridge in Cincinnati, Ohio. Again, you can see the American flags here and all the various symbols that remind you of Liberty Bell, that remind you of, linking McKinley to the American dream and to the various symbols of the country. Paper ballots. Today we are very proud of our being able to vote, and voting is a private. We go into a voting booth. We close the curtain behind us. That was not the way it was in the 19th century. When you had a paper ballot, you went in, you picked up a ballot, people could see which party's ballot you were picking up. They could actually, by telling the color and the names on it, they could see who you were voting, and of course they could see which box that the ballot box that you were putting in the slip of paper. So here is, I told you about the Southern Democratic ticket in 1860. This was a ballot for John Breckinridge and his vice presidential candidate and running mate, Joseph Lane. This was an election ballot from Virginia. Again, this shows you the various electors as well as the candidates themselves, but the various electors who you could also be voting for. 1864, this is the National Union ticket. This was a ballot for Lincoln and Johnson. And I'm not sure where this was produced. The names of the electors don't ring a bell to me, so I'm not really sure for what part of the country this was. But anyway, this gives you an example of what ballots looked like in the 19th century. And again, there's the American flag. And yes? Yes. That's a good question. I don't know. It could be. It could be. Yeah. In 1864, of course, Lincoln was running against George McClellan, and Pendleton, his vice presidential. This is from Philadelphia in 1864. So, of course, you see the various electors from different precincts and counties in the Philadelphia area and surrounding areas. But again, you know, on ballots, it wasn't unusual to have the picture of the candidate. Sheet music and songsters. Back to 1840 campaign. There is our friend William Henry Harrison. There's the log cabin. Again, a portrait of Harrison. If you didn't know what he looked like, you could get a sense of what he looked like. This was an engraving that was based on a daguerreotype that was taken of the Wigwam Grand March in 1860, produced by Oliver Ditson and Company in Boston. The Wigwam in the title stands for the temporary facility in Chicago where Lincoln was nominated for president of the Republican Party. There were a number of pieces of sheet music that were produced in the 1860 campaign for Lincoln. There were also songsters, and here is one from 1888 for the Democrat Grover Cleveland and his running mate, Alan Thurman. Songsters were a little different from the sheet music which was produced for piano or for marches. Songsters were lyrics that were put to popular tunes, such as Old Lang Syne or, trying to think of some other ones, that people would be familiar with the song, the music, but the lyrics were written in promoting a particular candidate. And this is something that you would put in your pocket and you would go out, and if you were involved in a parade and sort of a group singing, this is where the songster would come in. And again, there were a ton of these published in the 19th century. Then there were song sheets, and here is one for McClellan. This is McClellan Will Be President. This was published by Charles Magnus in 1864. The words by M.J. Million, to the air whack roadie-do. Never heard of roadie-do, but I guess a lot of people knew what that sounded like. Stationery. Again, we've seen some of these earlier this morning. Here is a postal cover from the 1860 campaign that, you know, if you mail this to somebody, you are showing your support for Abraham Lincoln. Again, Lincoln and Johnson, 1864. Here's for William Jennings Bryan in 1896. And in this cover, they're linking Bryan with George Washington, the first president. So in other words, the implied messages here is that vote for Bryan and you're getting another Washington. And then, of course, there was also stationery, campaign stationery, which, again, here is something from 1860 for Abraham Lincoln, a beardless Lincoln, because Lincoln didn't actually start growing a beard until after he was elected. Cartoons, another one. Here is this is a Currier and Ives from 1860, a lithograph by Lewis Marr. And this is an anti-Lincoln cartoon showing him straddling a rail, the rail splitter. Here's where the opponents of Lincoln are using the rail splitter image against Lincoln. And again, partly racist. You can see that the black man carrying the front of the rail, that's Horace Greeley taking up the rear, and two individuals that were mocked by Democrats. Here is something that, this is a metamorphic mechanical card from 1840, Martin Van Buren. And, you know, if you pull the little tab down at the bottom of the card, the expression on Van Buren's face changes. And the first part of the card says, the beautiful goblet of White House champagne. Again, this is the fop, the elite fop in the White House drinking champagne. You pull the card down, and then it says the ugly mug of log cabin hard cider. So anyway, and then again, this is another anti-Van Buren cartoon, A Hard Road to Hoe, where Van Buren, getting to the White House, has to go through all these log cabins and barrels of hard cider. You know, this is a hard road that he's got to slog to get there. Then finally, and this is something that I think about relating this to today. This is in 1896, William Jennings Bryan was basically taking over the Democratic Party to the concern of many Eastern Democrats. And it shows basically, this is from Puck, showing Bryan gobbling up the Democratic donkey. Advertisement and trade cards. We saw this, something like this morning. This is for General Hancock, who was running against James Garfield for the Democratic Party in 1880, and again promoting Frank Cousins' Beehive in Salem, Massachusetts. Garfield in 1880, running against Hancock. This is a sort of a cardboard artist palette promoting the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. So you turn the palette over and you see all the various cities where the tea company is. Again, this is a tobacco card produced in 1884. One of the candidates that was a possibility for president in 1884 was Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts, a Democrat, who actually ended up running as the Greenback Party ticket, a third-party ticket. But these were tobacco cards that were promoting honest, long-cut chewing and smoking tobacco. And then, of course, here you have the ad supporting Cleveland and Thomas Hendricks in 1884 in the Democratic Party by Eastman and Brown in Wentworth, New Hampshire, promoting the use of Quaker bitters. And you remember William Henry Harrison, 1840. Well, his grandson ran for the Republican presidency in 1888, and they resurrected the log cabin motif for his grandson. And this was, again, promoting Werner's log cabin sarsaparilla. And then others, and you know, I had to stop somewhere. But there was a couple items that sort of don't fall into one particular genre. Here is a Vauvel promoting William McKinley. And I'm not sure if this is in 1896 or I think it's in 1896. But if you turn the wheel a certain way, you see all of the good things that will come out of the election of McKinley, and you turn it another way, and you will see all the horrible things that will happen to the country if you elect William Jennings Bryan. Postcards, of course, were that came sort of later in the century, promoting the various candidacies of, and not only did you find, you see the candidate, but you also see their domestic, where they lived, so on and so forth, which was a good thing. Here is a paper shirt front promoting McKinley and Hobart in 1896, Chicago, the G.F. Albright Company. Again, just another idea. Paper hats. This was a McKinley-Bryan paper hat published by the Forbes Lithographic Company in 1896 from Boston. And this was a supplement to the Sunday Boston Globe. And depending on the way that you folded the hat, it could either be for McKinley or it could be for William Jennings Bryan. I could get in, I haven't even mentioned photographs. And again, photographs, particularly starting in 1860, you could buy CDVs of the various presidential candidates and then later cabinet cards, handbills, so on and so forth. But I had to stop this at some point. So anyway, I'll be glad to take any questions that you have. Yes.
Just a quick comment from the great state of Kentucky. If you'd like to see an example of the presidential possibility, John Carlisle of Kentucky, I've got the original and the exhibit in the exhibit room, and then I have photocopied the back so you can see that it does indeed list all the
Right, yes, yes. I saw,
No, Kentucky and tobacco, we had to use that.
I've seen your great exhibit, yeah.
Thanks.
Yes. Yes.
What was the role of religious publishers? I know there were things like Kristen Herald, and then Henry Ward Beecher edited something and published it. They must have played a big political role also.
They did, though there were religious almanacs, there were religious publications that would touch on various issues. But I can say, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong here, but actually seeing a lot of ephemera that was produced by religious organizations, I'm just not recalling seeing that much. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I just don't recall that. And I've followed political ephemera for years and used to collect it much more than I do now. And I just don't recall seeing a hell of a lot. You know.
I do wish I had kept from the 1990s a piece of paper that was handed to me at a Baptist church telling me who I should vote for and why on one side, and who I shouldn't vote for and why.
Well, and yes, and the Catholic
Church and state.
The Catholic Church did that as well, certainly, particularly over the abortion issue and all, when that became a relevant topic in the 20th century. Yes, you first, and then the guy back behind you.
The 1864 election, I think, was influenced quite heavily by the votes from the troops in the field.
That's right.
And I was wondering if there was any ephemera directed particularly at that.
There was, of course, they made sure, the Union Army made sure that pro-Lincoln material got to the troops on the field. Of course, they had access to newspapers. Yes, I mean, it got, I wouldn't say that there were ephemera that was directed specifically to the troops, but they made sure that the troops were getting the right kind of material. Yeah, so. Yes, behind.
A question about ethnic slurs in presidential campaign ephemera. In 1880, for instance, the candidate running against Garfield made issue of Chinese working for low wages. Do you know, have you seen other instances of that? Where a particular ethnic group is identified as the scapegoat?
Yes, particularly in cartoons in the later 19th century. Thomas Nast, for example, was a leader in terms of producing cartoons that were vicious, not only against particular politicians, but the caricatures that were presented, particularly of the Irish. The Irish were linked to the Democratic Party in cities, and they were portrayed as these ignorant people who were taken advantage of basically by giving them patronage jobs and handing out money in the street to get them to vote Democratic. And so that was something that was, you see a lot, particularly in the cartoons of the second half of the 19th century. Of course, the racial card was played, as we had seen here, particularly around the 1860 and 1864 elections, and even later than that. I mean, these were overtly racist. There was no hidden message here. I mean, this was basically, this is what we have to fear, and they were quite open about it.
Well, the piece I referred to is the broadside. If you want to work as cheap as the Chinese, vote for James A. Garfield.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Local slogan.
Right.
Massachusetts.
Right. Yep.
We've run out of time.
Okay.
Thank you,
We can talk later. Okay.